Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you can take your seats, please. Welcome to Wednesday. We need a bit of enthusiasm in the room, if we can. Jolly good. Thank you, that's better. And now if you can switch all your phones to silent, that would also be good. My name's John Pinniger. I'm from CFAS, which is the UK government marine science agency based in Lowestoft. But I'm also a co-chair of the joint ICES-PICES strategic initiative on climate change in the marine ecosystems, the horrible acronym SICME. It's a little bit unfortunate. It's my great pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Greta Petzl. And for those who've been getting her name wrong for all these years, that's how to pronounce it. That includes me. Okay. Greta is a professor of marine ecology at the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies and a director of the Centre for Marine Socioecology in Tasmania, Australia. Greta started her career working on the biology and ecology of cephalopods, working on the growth, physiology and movement patterns of octopus and squid. And she tells me this is one of her squid spawning sites on the coast of Australia. I first got to know Greta at an amazing meeting that we had in St. Petersburg. A lot of vodka has passed under the bridge since then. But at the same time, she introduced the group there to the concept of vulnerability assessments for climate change, where we look at the traits of species to look at how sensitive they are, something that they'd been doing very successfully in Australia for many years. And I'm now basically just copying everything that Greta's done for the last 15 years. Greta is a lead author on the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report that will be published in 2021 in the Australasia chapter. We're writing something together on fish species moving around and getting in the way of political boundaries together. Greta has spent quite a lot of time developing citizen science projects, and she's going to talk about that a little bit today. An amazing project getting members of the public to submit data on where they're seeing strange species out of where they would normally expect to see them. She's the driving force behind a very high-profile global-scale research project called Species on the Move, which brings together both terrestrial and marine people looking at how they're shifting their distribution in response to climate change. The first meeting was held in Hobart in 2016 and resulted in a very high-profile paper in Science. She's just come out of Kruger National Park, where they had the second meeting, where they had species on the move all around them, elephants and rhinos and all sorts of strange things. I've known Greta for quite a long while now, and I've never known her to be jet-lagged. She travels an awful lot, comes to Europe several times a year. In fact, she probably travels more than Greta Thunberg and talks about climate change. Yeah, so. Very looking forward to Greta's talk. She's going to talk on climate-driven redistribution of ocean life and its implications for society. So if you could please put your hands together for Greta Petzl.
Okay, thank you very much for those kind words, John. I'm not sure what to make about the Thunberg travelling comment, but I'll let that slide. And there was an awful lot of vodka in St. Petersburg, so I'm surprised you remembered that at all, but again, we'll let that slide. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along and talk at this annual science meeting. I've been very interested and intrigued by a lot of the work that ICES have been doing over the years, very impressed by the work as well, but I've never been to an annual science meeting, so it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be along in this capacity today. As John mentioned, this is a photograph of one of my very first sampling sites in the mid-90s. This was where I did a lot of my PhD work and then subsequently my first job as a research assistant, working with Jeremy Lyle, who's here, I think, at the moment. And a lot of my work was diving and fishing and looking at squid eggs on the ground, doing surveys. And I didn't know it at the time, but my foray into changes in species distribution and climate change started at this location when we started noticing new species turning up and wondering what kind of changes were happening. Was this related to the water temperature? And also getting very interested in how squid biology, that being very fast-growing dynamic animals, how that might change with climate. So over the years became very interested in climate change. And this is a picture of the east coast of Tasmania, which is currently warming at about 4 times the global average. So an area that's seen a lot of change, and I will show you some of that later. So this morning we're talking about changes in species distribution, and I think I find it so fascinating because it really gets to the heart of ecology and natural history. So what lives where and why. And when you think about it, the flora and fauna that we find around us really form a large part of our place attachment and our place dependence. And it's also something that comes to mind when we're thinking of different locations around the world. If you think of Australia, you'll probably think of koalas and kangaroos and snakes and giant spiders and things like that. And if you're thinking of other places, you know, Hawaii will be coconuts, Alaska might be bears. The species that we find around us really do form a large part of how we attach to different places and how we think of them. It's also, I think, a very interesting point that people that have a greater awareness of climate change and a greater engagement on climate change are often those people that have a greater sense of place attachment. So I think there's potential here for us to talk about this climate-driven redistribution of species and try and engage people on climate change more generally. And this morning we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges, the adaptation, and the opportunities about this climate-driven redistribution of species. I thought I'd start off with a little bit about my overarching research themes. So I look at, with an amazing team of collaborators, I should say, some of which are here today, I look at the impacts of climate change, I look at the adaptation options in human systems, and also engagement on climate change with the public. And we actually research that engagement as well, how to be more effective. So there's a lot of collaboration with interdisciplinary people, so economists, social scientists, psychologists even recently. But I would have been quite happy staying in that impacts box, or that impacts circle as it is up there on the picture. But I was never really tenure track, and I was forced, if you like, into the adaptation space to stay employed, to stay gainfully employed, and where the contracts and the grants were. As it turns out, I actually really liked working in that adaptation space. And then as my career progressed, I started working on public engagement around communication, because I felt quite strongly, and still feel quite strongly, that I don't want my career to be about documenting decline ever more robustly. I would like to have a role in engaging with the public on climate change. So I'm spread across those 3 research themes, a Jack or a Jill of all trades, expert of none. And I think a lot of people, when we think about that progression from impacts to adaptation to engagement with the public, would think about it in this linear kind of way. But with my research, it's very much interconnected. There's a lot of feedbacks between those 3 research areas. We work at different scales across those. Some projects might be all about impacts, others might be all about engagement, and some are across all of those areas. As I mentioned, lots of different collaborators, and there is definitely that strong focus on climate-driven changes in species redistribution, but a lot of other areas that we work on as well. So if we start talking about climate-driven changes in distribution, we know that there are some very significant movements polewards on land and in the ocean, deeper in the ocean as well. We know that those shifts in distribution are greatest where the climate has warmed the most. And where we go in and look at any one particular region or taxa, which is what each one of those blue bars is from a number of studies around the world, from some of you in the audience here, each one of those studies shows that there's at least between 25 and 85% of species that are already changing distribution. So we're already seeing a very large redistribution of life on Earth. And some of the estimates are suggesting that this is the largest redistribution of life on Earth since the last glacial maximum, which is around 21,000 years ago. One of my collaborators from the Species on the Move project, Jonathan Lenore, he's been collating a systematic database of all these changes in distribution. There's at least 30,000 different species that have undergone a change in distribution around the world on land and in the ocean so far. So they're only the changes that somebody's recorded and reported. So I really do think that's probably the tip of the iceberg. And even though I work in this area, I still find it pretty mind-blowing that we are living through a redistribution of life on Earth as we know it. So these shifts in distribution matter because they affect ecosystem structure and function, they affect food security for a number of poorer regions around in the world in particular. They affect human health through changes in the distribution of diseases or venomous species or species that are dangerous to humans in some other way. People's livelihoods, and fisheries obviously is a classic example there. They even affect feedbacks to the climate system. So the distribution of mangroves, for example. Mangroves sequester a large amount of carbon from our atmosphere. As the distribution of mangroves is impacted, that affects the local climate. Feedbacks in the Arctic, greening in the Arctic would be another example. As the Arctic warms up, shrubs and trees can grow to a higher elevation, and that changes the local feedbacks on the climate. And then human culture. And that obviously is another factor that encompasses a range of impacts as well, from different local communities through to Indigenous communities around the world, where some of these impacts on culture might be particularly significant. And of course, throughout history, countries have battled over natural resources. Territories, resources, these are all things that have created conflicts throughout the world's history. And now we have all our resources changing distribution. So I think the potential there, and obviously a demonstrated number of examples there, for significant conflict between different countries or different regions, between winners and losers. If something's shifting, one region is gaining it and another region is losing it. If we look at just two impacts on, or two separate sort of impacts on fisheries in particular, this one's from Japan. So there was a climate-driven range extension of tropical herbivorous fishes. They're overgrazing the temperate algae there, and that led to a collapse in the abalone fishery in just 4 years. So a substantial abalone fishery and then a collapse 4 years later. Another example from my region, from Tasmania, Centrostephanus, the long-spined sea urchin there, first detected at the top of Tasmania in 1978. This was one of the species that we were seeing in the mid-90s when we were diving off the east coast of Tasmania. It's estimated recently in 2017, I think that number comes from, there's around 20 million individuals, and the rocky urchin barrens cover around 15% of our inshore rocky reefs now along that east coast. That has had a very substantial impact on our rock lobster and our abalone fisheries. But interestingly, one of the adaptation responses that have happened in response to that is the creation of an urchin fishery and subsidies for the urchin fishery. And just recently, there was almost 600 tonnes of urchins taken out of that area. So there has been a substantial impact, but there's also been a substantial response. What we also know is that what we see in the literature is a massive underestimate and a very gross oversimplification of these processes and patterns. So John mentioned the Species on the Move conference, which we hosted in July in Kruger National Park, which was an amazing place for a conference. You'd come back from sessions and there'd be warthogs on the steps of your bungalow and, you know, hippopotamus at breakfast and things like that. So it was absolutely amazing going to a conference on biology and being immersed in the biology. But what that recent conference showed us was that there are many more examples of shifts and impacts that haven't yet made it to the literature, some quite large numbers of shifts and impacts, and that our understanding of these processes is really just scratching the surface. But we are getting a better understanding of some of the basic patterns, but I don't think we're getting a good handle yet on some of the mechanistic processes that underlie those patterns. And that's what we need to transform from descriptive ecology through to predictive ecology. So if we take a look at some of the patterns at a continental scale that we're seeing in Australia, this is from a systematic literature review of published studies, and we looked at what are some of the changes in distribution that we're seeing around the coast. So there were around 200 changes in distribution that had been detected in the marine system around Australia. Tasmania showed up as a definite hotspot for these changes. Most of the changes in distribution were range extensions, because with range shift you can either have an extension into at the cooler edge, or you can have a contraction of the range at the warmer edge. So in Tasmania we're seeing mainly range extensions. In eastern Australia, and that's the blue bar and the blue circle there off the coast, we're seeing a larger proportion of contractions, so species at their warmer edge contracting. And in Western Australia, that's the grey bar there, we're seeing a focus on the marine heat waves that they've had there, really facilitating some changes in habitat and facilitating the overwintering of a number of species there that allows them to get a foothold. But these patterns that we're seeing, I think, are very spatially biased because they're focused around regions of commercial importance or where we're seeing high human population. So I think it's a very biased, imperfect pattern that we've got recorded so far. And this graph here shows from another study which looked at the amount of research effort in general around climate change in these different regions of Australia. And there's a bit of a surprising pattern between the research effort on climate change, which is in the black bars there, and the changes that we're seeing in distribution. So I think the patterns that we're seeing in changes in distribution are very influenced by the information where we're looking in the first place. So I don't think they could be described as systematic patterns. But we're seeing at least, that should be around 200 species now, actually a few more have come through in the literature. We're seeing lots of changes in fish, in algae, and invertebrates. There's different data sources that underlie those reports, and then there's obviously caveats and issues, different caveats and issues with those data sources. But we are seeing changes in distribution in quite a number of different types of species. If we look at the particular changes that are occurring, and this is quite a complicated graph, but this bar here shows poleward expansions. These are of the cool edge. This is a poleward contraction of the warm edge. And then these ones here are species that are having the contraction at the warm edge and the extension at the cool edge. So these, the ones with the star, are those that indicate that the direction consistent with what we expect with climate change. And we know that at least 90% of these observed changes are consistent with the patterns we'd expect with climate velocity, so the direction of climate. But as I mentioned, there is significant bias, and we're really acutely aware of that bias. So most of our information comes from either fish species or from inshore reef areas, and the reef areas only, not the sandy habitats or other offshore areas. Most studies are usually only looking at one range edge, so they're usually only looking for extensions. We're not looking for contractions at the other end of the population or changes that are occurring in the mid-range of the distribution. And we know that there's significant geographic bias. So we are starting to describe some patterns, but I'm personally quite dubious of what those patterns actually mean. I think they show us the extent and the minimum of what's occurring, but it's not really overly helpful at the moment in terms of getting to predictions and to understanding the processes that are underlying these patterns. We also know that there's a very big variation in the rate and the magnitude of these shifts. And if we take a look at what we think underlies some of that variation in the rate and the magnitude, the first thing is that the method of detection, and this was a study from Chris Brown in Queensland, or led by Chris in Queensland, and 22% of the variation in range shift rate and magnitude can be explained by the method of detection. Now, if we got an effect size of 22% in an experiment or something, we'd think that was quite good. That's a substantial amount of variation to be explaining. But obviously in this context, it's I think, highlights a substantial problem with the field of redistribution ecology at the moment, and that we really need to be looking at generating some standards around the methods that we use and how we describe and detect these patterns. We do know, though, that 40% of the rate of variation can be explained by climate velocity, so that's the rate of movement of the temperature isotherm through the seascape. And around 57% can be explained by the combination of climate velocity and species traits. And if we have a look at that for a minute, Jennifer Sunday came and did a short postdoc with us a couple of years ago. And her work looked at the rates of range shift off the east coast of Australia, and she was able to show that widely distributed species, like the top two here, yellowtail kingfish and the southern Maori wrasse, so widely distributed species were moving faster, and then species that were a lower trophic level were also moving faster. So some relationship there between the traits and the rate of shift. And then in regions where we've got an agreement between the current speed and direction and the climate velocity, there was an even higher explanation around the rate and magnitude of shifts, and that's some of Jorge Molinos's global work. So we are starting to get a little bit of an understanding of what's happening and what describes, what accounts for some of this variation, but there's still a lot of caveats and a lot more that needs to be explored. So some of the issues that I think we haven't covered yet include detectability, so we're not able yet to understand patterns of species that have a very low detectability, so cryptic little snails, other species like that, whereas if we're seeing shifts in things like whale sharks down the west coast of Australia, then people notice that and they report that. We're not really looking at ecological interactions, so how these species are dependent upon habitat or on predators and prey. And when we're not really thinking about the stage of the range shift that we're measuring. And what I mean by that is we talk about range shifts like they're a binary thing. It's a yes or a no. But obviously it doesn't happen like that. It's a process that happens over time. And as a process, it's where do you draw the line? When do we say a range shift has actually taken place? And I think different studies are referring to different things. Some people are referring to this arrival stage here as a range shift. Other people are looking at when there's a few individuals and they look like they're reproductively viable, and other studies are only considering it a range shift when there's been a persistent population in an area for a period of time. However, we still don't have any guidelines on how do we define the range edge. How far does a range edge need to shift to count? Is it 1 kilometre? Is it 20 kilometres? That obviously needs to be related in some way to the dynamic nature of the range edge in the first place. And when does it count? Do we say it's a range shift if there's been a population there for a year, or does it need to be 10 years? Is that related to the lifespan and generation time of the organism in the first place? So we've got lots of different people working on this challenge, but we're all going about it in slightly different ways. And I think the devil's in the detail, and that makes it an incredibly difficult, complicated process to look at. It's also complicated because there are other changes occurring in addition to changes in distribution. And so I'd love you to go to Asta's talk today at 3:20. She's looking at, do fishes get smaller in warmer waters? Body size, temperatures, relationships in temperate and tropical species. And a spoiler alert, it's not as simple as you would think. So she's found some fascinating patterns happening in body size around the whole coast of Australia. Some interesting clear patterns, but it's not as simple or as straightforward as you would think. So other changes happening in addition to these changes in distribution. Another point I wanted to highlight is that we often talk about changes in distribution as species must adapt, move, or die, like they're different things, different categories of process. But really, these species are probably doing most of those things in the one location. So plasticity, adaptation, and movement aren't mutually exclusive, and we've been treating them like they are. So we really need to start examining some of these processes and also doing that within different parts of the distribution. So we talk about the trailing edge, so that's the edge that's contracting. I'm sorry, I've got my hemispheres around the wrong way, haven't I? So contracting up this way, extending the other way. I find that very, very challenging. That's half the reason why we talk about poleward movements, because I can do that even when I'm jet lagged, but north and south is a bit tricky. So there's different processes happening within different parts of the distribution, and again, they're not independent. Things that are happening on a contracting edge or a leading edge are probably related in some way to what's happening at the core of the distribution as well. So it's a conundrum wrapped up in an enigma, trying to figure out what's happening with these populations in terms of distribution. At the moment, we are also very species focused, and that sounds like a strange thing to say because of course we are species focused. We're talking about changes in species distribution, but what I mean by that is, again, we're thinking about the species in isolation. So we'll often talk about the shiftiness of the species. What is its local climate velocity that it's experienced? What are the species' life history traits or its physiological responses? We might get into what are some of the direct interactions, so what are its habitat requirements or its predator or its prey, but we're definitely not yet made that progression into ecosystem level thinking. And I think we do need to start thinking about the receptiveness of the receiving community. So a community might be dependent on the resident ecological network or some opportunity niche in trait space to be receptive to new species coming into that region. So when you think about it, a range shift must be a combination of how shifty the species is and how receptive that community is. So for example, we could have a species that's really quite shifty, like our long-spine sea urchin, and that might be able to move successfully into an area that has pretty low receptiveness. But another species that might have a low shiftiness for whatever reason, that might only be able to move into an area that's really receptive to new species for some reason. And I think there's a lot of parallels with that with other research fields. So invasion ecology, you wouldn't talk about how invasive a species is without thinking about the recipient ecosystem. And it's the same with disease. We need to talk about the infectious agent and the characteristics of the host. And at the moment, with range shift ecology or redistribution ecology, I think we are very focused on the species and we haven't yet made this extension into the ecosystem. And I think it's particularly important that we make that move fairly quickly. If we look at invasion ecology, so looking at invasive species in that definitional context, they've had several decades now to generate and to test hypotheses. So what hypotheses have played out in terms of invasion ecology and what determines or dictates the success of invasive species? And as it turns out, there was a review a couple of years ago that looked at the success of hypotheses in an invasion ecology context, and they looked at hypotheses that were only related to the ecosystem, only related to the invaders, and then ones that were related to the combination of ecosystem-invader interactions. And what they found was it was those ecosystem-invader interactions that had the highest support. So I think that's a bit of an indicator that potentially that will also be very important in range shift ecology. Now, of course, every range shift is not going to have the impact of an invasive species, but I think a certain proportion of them will, and there's a lot that we can borrow from invasion ecology and apply and learn from in terms of redistribution ecology. Interestingly, one of the most supported hypotheses in invasion ecology was something called invasional meltdown. And invasional meltdown is where the presence of existing invasive species in an ecosystem facilitates the invasion by additional invasive species. And you might remember from one of the first slides that we know that at least 25 to 85% of our native species are changing distribution, probably in response, or many of those in response to climate. So we are likely having our species move into systems where there's existing climate-driven redistributions. So what's the potential there for invasion or meltdown, if you like? I think it points to us really needing to extend into that ecosystem context to try and understand these processes properly. I thought it's also interesting to note that invasion ecology has got, depending on how you define the start of the field, roughly a 30 or a 50-year advantage compared to species redistribution ecology. And they've made, you know, some extraordinary leaps in understanding, and this isn't a criticism of the field, but they are still dealing with a lot of challenges, a lot of methodological challenges. So this is just one paper that looked at some of the difficulties that invasion ecology is still dealing with, and it's things like terminology and unclear concepts, a lack of data to test hypotheses, you know, bias in their data collection, and around the complexity of the processes. So if this is a field that's been established for 30 or 50 years and they're still dealing with challenges of terminology, then what does that sort of say for how we should be getting organised in terms of redistribution ecology? So I wonder what, you know, if we talk to invasion biologists in the 1950s, 1980s, and if they could look forward and see what had played out, how much of an impact invasive species have had in our natural systems, what would they have been thinking they'd wished they'd done, you know, back at the start of this process? So, and I think that's what we should be doing. We should be thinking, you know, how do we want to try and be strategic about redistribution ecology, knowing that this is the status quo from now on. We're having massive changes in our species distributions, and that's the way it will be for the foreseeable future. So how do we set up our research field so that we can not be having these same problems 30 or 50 years down the track, like invasion ecology? And I don't think there's any magic bullet there. But one of the other issues that invasion ecology highlighted was that society places different value on different invasive species. And a recent publication by Brett Sheffers and myself found that that's a similar thing that we're seeing in non-invasive species, in changes in distribution of native species as well. So depending upon the ecosystem value or the ecological value and the society values, we're managing these changes in distribution, these native species changes in distribution differently. So if we decide we like the species, we might protect it. If we don't like it, we'll persecute it. A whole stack of things we ignore. But it's been kind of random. You might have one species and there's been a different response in two different locations. So if we're having, you know, 30,000 species already changing distribution as a function of climate, are we going to leave it up to random ad hoc kind of decision making, or are we going to try and come up with some kind of strategy and reasoning and criteria for how we manage these changes in distribution going forward? So I think there needs to be a lot of strategic thought into how we look at this giant challenge for the future. So redistribution ecology is a rapidly growing field. This is another study from a few years back looking at the proportion of publications in the field and the increase there, the number of journals looking at changes in distribution. So there's been a lot of really good work, but I think we're still just scratching the surface. So looking at climate-driven redistribution, I think, is a pretty fascinating opportunity for ecology and evolution. In a way, it's an experiment that we get to look at what sets distributions in the first place and those kinds of questions. So I think it's a pretty crappy natural experiment, but it is a natural experiment that allows us to explore a whole lot of interesting things about ecology and evolution. But we definitely need to move from this descriptive explanatory ecology and move into predictive ecology, given this is going to be something that continues to transform our natural and our managed systems for the foreseeable future. So I think there is, definitely an urgent need for us to think very strategically as a research field, not just about the processes and how we get at trying to develop this mechanistically based understanding of what's happening, but also what do we want these systems to look like and what do we value? So I think it's a very big challenge. So we'll switch now to adaptation to species on the move, and obviously adaptation is something that needs to happen at a whole range of different spatial scales, globally, at the country level, in the high seas, regional fisheries, local communities, and also different conservation approaches. So there's challenges in many contexts for looking at species on the move. I did want to talk about a particular project here called Future Seas, which looks at, it's not adaptation per se, but it looks at creating a vision for what we want this challenge to look like by 2030. It looks at a whole range of different challenges, this broader project like plastics and food security and a whole range of things. One of the challenges in that project is looking at species redistribution and how could we transform our management systems by 2030. I'm just throwing that in there because I don't have time to, I took it out because I thought I don't have time to do it properly, but if anyone wants to talk about that project, I would love to later. So the two things I am going to talk about are a country, federal level adaptation or adaptation planning, and then local community adaptation. So looking at the first one, the government level adaptation planning, we did a study looking at the 40 fastest warming areas in the world, or countries with fast warming areas. So these are the areas in orange there. They're in the top 10% for rates of warming. And we looked at the countries that had waters in each of those areas, and we looked for national level adaptation plans and strategy documents for marine biodiversity and fisheries adaptation. And we trawled through a whole lot of different websites and organisations that had data repositories looking at national adaptation plans. And we also sent individual emails to researchers, probably a number of you in the room here, asking about what kind of national level adaptation planning have your countries or your governments got. And what we found was not exactly very encouraging, given that these are the fastest warming regions in the world, or fastest by our measure, which was sea surface temperature over a 50-year time period. And we found that 12 of these countries had absolutely no mention of fisheries or marine biodiversity planning and adaptation in any of their documents. Some 11 had a national adaptation plan. I can't see the screen because there's light right where you need to be reading the text. National adaptation plan for all sectors, but they only had a very minor mention of fisheries or biodiversity, so a very cursory dealing with adaptation in that context. Another 11 countries had specific actions recommended or planned, but nothing that had happened yet. Only 2 had specific actions that had been undertaken around marine biodiversity and fisheries. 3 had detailed sectoral plans. They were, not surprisingly, US, UK and Australia. And when we looked at what were some of the explanatory factors or factors associated with degree of planning in these countries, the 2 things that came out, and this was with a random forests analysis with a whole range of things, was density of biological data post-1980 and the extent of international research collaborations. That was from Scopus. So the 2 things that led to adaptation planning was recent biological data and those international collaborations. But taking a broad look at the countries in the world that are having the highest rate of warming, probably the highest rate of rain shifts, and very little government level adaptation planning for marine biodiversity and fisheries at all. And throughout those documents, there was only really a mention around changes in distribution in the full sectoral plans. So we're not considering these processes yet at a whole of government level. If we go to the local scale now, and that would be looking at the east coast of Tasmania, which I mentioned earlier is warming at almost 4 times the global average. And I love this graphic because I think it really clearly shows how we're getting a double whammy off the east coast of Tasmania. We're getting the underlying warming that most of the rest of the ocean gets, and we have a change in current system with the East Australian current pushing much further down the coast, sitting there for longer over summer and then retreating. So it's warming at almost 4 times the global average, and it's predicted to remain that way in the future. We've had some pretty massive changes, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of changes in distribution. So we've had those sea urchins, we've got a new octopus species. That was some work by Jorge Ramos, who is here today. Around 50% of our intertidal species have moved further south over 50 years, or polewards. Dozens of fish species, and we could add quite a few dozen more formally to that record now. It just hasn't been published yet. And around 85% of our seaweeds are also further south, further polewards. So lots of changes off the east coast of Tasmania. So what's been the response from our industries based on those changes? We know that there's been little government action on climate change, on fisheries globally. So we started collating what were some of the autonomous responses that these our different marine sectors had been doing in response to that. And by autonomous, I mean what kind of changes had they made that they didn't need to have a management change or somebody else facilitate that. So these are changes that these different marine stakeholders were doing just off their own bat. And we looked at divers, recreational fishers, commercial fishers, charter operators, and then different aquaculture facilities. And we looked at what kinds of adaptation options they were doing. And we found there was about 30 different things. And interestingly, a lot of the resource managers and the researchers were not aware that the industry had already started adapting and making these changes until we went and asked them. So there were charter operators advertising trips for new species. There were changes to product handling and landing practices in abalone and in rock lobster, changes in farming practices, and using seasonal forecasting for farm management. That was one that we were aware of because it was a researcher-provided product. So lots of changes that our stakeholders are actively doing. So a very active adaptation landscape, even though at a government level it doesn't look like there's a lot happening. So in terms of looking at characterising those adaptation options, if I put in orange the main things that people were doing, they were looking at capacity building, changing practices, seeking information, they were asking for or generating warning or observing systems, and changes in technology. But what we also found was that at least half of those autonomous adaptations were potentially countervailing to some of the planned government or management-led adaptations. And the managers were not aware that these changes were all happening. So for me, it really highlighted that we need to make sure that our adaptation planning is coordinated across the autonomous changes, the planned local level adaptations, and then the country level adaptation planning as well. So there needs to be greater strategic coordination across these levels so that we don't get maladaptation to some of these changes. In general, I think adaptation to climate change is very complicated and messy. We've got that low awareness of what's happening in the first place, but it's a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder challenge where people have different competing interests and values. As I mentioned earlier, if things are changing and moving distribution, that means that there's winners and losers. That makes it a very fraught challenge to work on. And so it needs to be something that's very interdisciplinary. So we need to make sure that we have our industry participants at the table, and economists and social scientists and all sorts of different people in the room when we're talking about developing these adaptation options and evaluating them. I wanted to shift now just to the last few slides, talking about species on the move as a climate change communication and engagement opportunity. So yes, there are significant challenges with this process in general, or these processes, and then how we adapt to them, but I think there is one enormous advantage around species on the move, and that is as a communication vehicle for us to talk to the general public and to industries about climate change more broadly. So we know that climate change, a lot of people have problems with it because they perceive it to be too far into the future, too big to believe. They think somebody else is going to deal with it. They don't understand the impacts that are happening in some other part of the world to some other people that they've never heard of. And so it's really easy to have this psychological distance from the problem. But we know that climate change engagement can be effective if there are cognitive, affective and behavioural elements to the way that we communicate that. And I think Species on the Move, because it taps into that place-based attachment that people have, it makes climate change potentially something that's locally relevant to people. It's something that's tangible that they can tap into. So it can definitely get to that intellectual and the emotional components of what we need to communicate climate change effectively. And then if you add citizen science into that, you're also getting into the action. So we've got all three of those elements there of intellectual, emotional and some behavioural action to try and make effective, genuine engagement on climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular project that John mentioned, REDMap, or the Range Extension Database and Mapping Project. And we started that project because we thought, imagine if we could get just a small percentage of the observations of fishers and divers that are out around the country, around the coastline, seeing these different species and going, oh, I wonder what that is. Is that something that's unusual? And so we developed REDMap, or the Range Extension Database and Mapping Project. The point of that is to document out-of-range observations. We list on the website around 220 species that we are actively after observations for in particular regions. So if you see a snapper south of St Helens, send a photo in. If you see a coral trout in Victoria, send a photo in. But people can also send in anything that they see or observe that they think or know is unusual. So it's essentially taking observations and pictures from the community and turning that into data. And we have two really broad aims for the project, and they are equally important, and we've researched both arms of these aims. So one is that monitoring for ecological change, and we phrase that as an early indication of what species might be changing distribution. And to give you an example of that, we were getting an octopus reported along the north coast of Tasmania. People were saying, oh, but we don't have the data, maybe it's always been here. So we got a PhD student, Jorge Ramos, who's now working in the Falklands, to do a genetic study looking at this species. And we were able to show that there had been a recent rapid range extension in that species. So that's what we mean by early indication. We get the early indication from the citizen data, and then if it looks like something, we'll go and investigate that in detail. But we also have the aim with the project of engaging, informing and educating our marine communities using their own data. So we can go to recreational fishing meetings and talk and start these discussions with what the community has seen or observed. So I think it puts it on a different playing field or a different footing, rather than being scientists that swan in and go, here's what my model says, trust me. We can still say that, but we can start the discussion with what the community have actually brought and contributed to the table. So we really see it as two-way knowledge exchange in partnership. And I just wanted to point out that we actually have a verification system. So if someone sends in a photo of a snapper, a link gets sent directly to our snapper expert. He or she looks at the photo, other characteristics of the photo, the size reported, all sorts of different things, the metadata of the location in the photo, and compares it to the reported location, ticks a few boxes, and an automatic email gets sent to the observer which says it was that species, it was out of range, it wasn't. So there's a verification process that goes with this, and only then is the data displayed on the website. We're getting a whole range of different sightings around the country, and the data's been able to be used in about 25 different journal articles. Most of the time it's a small contribution to a bigger project, but it provides a unique aspect to particular studies. And then there's a few publications now where it's mostly REDMap data. But each observation that comes in is a communication opportunity with the public. This one is a manta ray off the northeast coast of Tasmania. It was very unusual. I think it appeared in the second or third page of our local newspaper as well. Got shared hundreds of times on Facebook. And I think it's it's unusual because if we were looking at, say, temperature change, we can't go back to the public every 5 minutes and go, ooh, it's 17.2 degrees, it's 17.2, it's 17.21. It's boring, right? But when you've got new things popping up in different locations, each one of those is the opportunity to say the same thing but in a different way. You know, species X turned up, that's unusual. Maybe it's because the waters are warming. And we do try and be careful not to say that every observation is a range shift. We say we need to look at patterns over time, but each observation is a communication opportunity. We also know that communication through citizen science is effective because we evaluate it. So we know that the project has been successful in terms of engagement because 80% of people have said that they are aware now that species are shifting, that that's related to climate change. Around 53% said they had a greater understanding of marine climate change impacts. 78% said that they'd shared information with another person. So we're getting transmission of information within the different marine communities about what this project is showing, and there was a high degree of trust over the information as well. And I'm sure you're all aware of, you know, the data that's coming in on trust and science and fake news. So we were quite happy that 97% of people said they trusted the information coming out of the project. So I think it's a big challenge, but it's also a very big opportunity. And related to that, we've been developing other communication products, one of which is this packet of playing cards. It's called Go Fish Tasmania. It features some of our more common species. These have just gone into, I've got a display pack here, but they've just gone into production. It means we'll be giving these out at our public events now instead of plastic dolphins, which I think is fantastic because we don't even work on dolphins. So we'll be able to give away these paper educational packs of cards. But if you notice here, there's two species that have got red borders on them. And when you look at the rules, it says, you know, this is the game that's fishy, fishy, have you got a dolphin fish, have you got a whatever, and then you put pairs together. It says you win the game if you end up with the most number of pairs. But red map species counts as double, and that it explains that these are new things that are coming into our region. And so if you catch them in Go Fish, it's double points. If you see them in real life, log them on the website. So we'll be giving these out to the public, to the industry, to school kids, and they'll get to know that new things are coming into our region, and this is how you deal with them. So we've got the Go Fish one, and we've got the Marine Match one. Same thing, different species coming in. So I think there's opportunities to kind of upscale these kinds of communication activities, and we have a whole suite of other communication activities, some of which relate to changes in distribution, and again, I'd be really happy to talk to people about that. My next crazy idea is to approach one of the major supermarkets in Australia to try and have these as giveaways around the country. And as it happens, one of our new director at IMAS has the sustainability officer from one of the supermarkets as one of his ex-employees. So I think we might have a good shot at actually having this as a campaign that goes around the country, learning about changes in distribution. So just to finish up, I think there are some pretty big challenges and opportunities in these range shifts of not just marine species, but all species. We know that these changes in distribution are really fundamentally changing our natural and our managed systems. We know that this is the way it's going to be for the next 100 years at least. And that almost everything is changing all at once. Lots of changes in species distribution, lots of changes within species ranges, and lots of different processes all happening and changing at the same time. I think we desperately need a mechanistic process-based understanding so that we can have some hope of predicting these future changes. So I think it's a fascinating area that would be pretty stimulating for people to get into, and we really need that. The human systems are already having some pretty major changes. Adaptation is absolutely possible, but there are going to be some pretty significant limits to that, and we need planning in terms of how we go about understanding the process itself, the changes in distribution, and how we actually do the adaptation planning. So it's a redistribution of life on Earth, and it's a pretty big problem, and we're really just scratching the surface. But I think it is an incredible opportunity as well for us as a broad research field to really try and engage industries and communities on climate change in a way that is tangible and locally relevant to people. So I think it's a potentially very powerful change maker, if you like, in terms of public understanding on climate change. And that is everything. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got time for a few questions.
Hello, Dorothy Dunkel from the University of Bergen. Thank you very much. It was really, really nice talk, but I'm a bit worried. And the reason I'm worried is all these governance and the lack of climate adaptation plans that you showed, and things are happening really fast. And I have a theory that we're not really good at telling these narratives of the future, the social scientific stories. So you talked a lot about the descriptive, and I'm totally with you that we have to gather data, but we also have to tell these possible narratives of the future, because my theory is that that's how you can get a type of collective action. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think that's the bit I cut out of my talk. So I mentioned the Future Seas project, which is exactly that. That is taking 11 different key challenges for marine systems in general. It's a project that involves 110 people in Tasmania, and the project has philosophers, psychologists, human health people, people looking at behaviour change, media people, marketing people, as well as the usual suspects of ecologists and all sorts of different people. And for each of the key challenges, and changes in distribution is one of them, plastics is another, the teams are generating 2 different futures based on a process called foresighting. And the point of that is to develop the business as usual future, so where we're kind of headed if things just continue the way they are, but then what's the technically possible, more sustainable future that we could achieve by 2030. And I started that project because I find we get caught in this space of we can't be too doom and gloom, we should be optimistic, but that kind of annoys me because we're not headed in the optimistic way, but we're constantly told that that's what we should be. And so the point of this project, so at the centre of each of these investigations is a graphical depiction of these 2 futures. One is where we're going, one's where we could head, which in most cases is generally better. And I think presenting those possibilities alongside of each other is potentially a more balanced way of doing that. We can't be, accused of being too doom and gloom, because we have got the optimistic scenario there as well. But I think it's more realistic because we've got this is where we're going and it's pretty crappy, but actually we could head over here if we wanted, to try and create the vision of where we could technically head if we chose to move in that direction. But the reason we have psychologists, philosophers, and marketing and media people involved in the project is that having the data and the knowledge to get to the more sustainable future is completely insufficient to get there. I think we absolutely need to have more data and a higher degree of knowledge, but data on its own does not make decisions. People make decisions. And so I think I completely, wholeheartedly agree with you that we need to have a much stronger interdisciplinary look at where we want to go and how we get there. But yeah, I cut it out. I decided it was a bit, it was too hard to explain, and so I, cut that out.
Any other questions? Okay, there's one at the back, in the middle, it would be.
Thanks. That's a long way for the mic to travel. And thank you for a very great talk. I have a question regarding how you get people to interact with the red map. So it's really great having a very nice tool, but how do you actually get people to use it? How do you spread the awareness of the map, and how is it promoted in the region where it's...
So we have a pretty comprehensive communications plan. and we talk about what's called circles of influence of the project. So at the core of our project, we need fishers and divers. Then around that, we need the scientists and the funders and the university on board. And then around that, we need the general public to be helping spread the message. And we look at each sort of component of that audience, if you like, and think about what communication vehicles are they using already to communicate with each other. What options have we got in a low-cost kind of way, because we've got the whole country, so, 40,000 kilometres of coastline to try and interact and engage with people on. There is a publication that we've just had out actually in Frontiers of Marine, whatever it's called. Look, describing the whole, marine science, is that it? Describing the whole project and talking about the challenges of the communication. But we have Facebook, we have Twitter. We've done things like we've actually gone out into the community and entered fishing competitions and entered, dive club competitions and things like that. So instead of being the, nerdy scientists that rock up and want to talk about climate change, we're actually sort of infiltrating, if you like, which is pretty labour intensive. And I think many citizen science projects fail because they might be great ideas, but they think, I'll build it, and then people will just rock up and give me stuff, and that is absolutely not how it works. You need to have consistent engagement and feedback and make people feel valued. One of my recent PhD students spent her whole PhD looking at what the citizen scientist got out of the project and how we could improve that whole process as well. So if you're interested, email me and I can shoot you some things.
Thank you.
I'll take another one if there is another one. Okay, we'll go in the middle over here.
Hi, Greta, thanks. I'm curious if you've thought about how biogeography might help understand range shifts. You talked a lot about invasion ecology, but biogeographers have been thinking about these same questions for 100 years or more, and if you've gotten any insights from thinking about that.
Not specifically, but in my pile of half-done papers from the journal of probably half dead and never will be published, there is an outline of a paper from a workshop in Argentina a couple of years ago about reciprocal learnings from different fields, and biogeography, invasion ecology, range limit theory. There's a whole lot of different bodies of literature that I think we could absolutely learn from, both in terms of redistribution ecology, can learn from them, but also now that we have got species shifting and moving around so quickly, that can surely help inform and in a way test a lot of hypotheses from other bodies of literature as well. So I completely agree, and hopefully one day there will be a paper that magically appears that talks about reciprocal learnings from different fields of research.
Okay, I think we will take one more, and then this is the last one.
Hello, my name is Per Sandberg. I work at the Directorate of Fisheries in Norway. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. You had one slide showing some fish moving along the waters and a bureaucrat running in the background saying that there's no agreement yet and so on, which made me think about the UN process of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction.
Yeah.
This work must be of great value for that process. Are you in a sort of communication in that process? Thank you.
There was a paper recently led by Gretta Pecl that I was involved in that looked at connectivity around the new agreement in the high seas. And we did write about how changes in distribution will affect a lot of the connections between different countries high seas waters and different countries. And that it would need to be factored in, but that's about as far as we've gotten. But critically important, yeah.
Okay, I think we'd better draw it to a close. We do have some gifts for you to say thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I think we're probably going to want a photo, aren't we?
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much, everybody. We're starting again at 10:30, and just one last round of applause, please. That was brilliant.
Maybe I'll get a picture of the trees over here.
Okay.
Not holding books and stuff.